3 days. That is what stands between the government of Canada and a 50% tariff on $20 billion worth of its exports to the United States. Not a threat anymore. Not a talking point on cable news. A signed order dated July the 20th, sitting in a drawer in Washington, ready to activate at midnight on August 19th. And in the final stretch before that deadline hits, Ottawa has done something that has quietly rewritten the entire negotiation. According to multiple outlets tracking the talks, including the Washington Post and the Detroit News, Canadian and American negotiators have assembled a joint framework, a real detailed plan, and put it in front of the two men who will decide whether North America's most integrated trading relationship survives the week intact or takes its biggest hit since the tariff war began. That plan is now sitting on Donald Trump's desk, and depending on how you read the last 72 hours of reporting out of Washington and Ottawa, it may be less a peace offering than a trap he built for himself. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to what actually happened on July 20th. On that date, President Trump signed what trade lawyers refer to as Section 338 tariffs, an obscure and rarely used provision of American trade law that had not been meaningfully deployed in generations. It authorizes the president to impose duties on a foreign country's goods without the exemptions that normally apply under existing trade agreements. In this case, the target was Canada, and the number attached was 50%, applied across 554 separate tariff lines, covering roughly $20 billion in Canadian exports to the United States. According to reporting confirmed by Reuters, CBC News, CTV News, and the Globe and Mail, these are not marginal products. Hockey sticks, cement, plywood, milk, beer, wine, items that sit at the center of Canadian manufacturing towns and provincial economies, hit with a tariff rate that, under normal circumstances, would never even apply to them because normally, goods that comply with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade pact that replaced NAFTA, are protected from exactly this kind of blanket punishment. Not this time. The July 20th order explicitly overrides that protection. According to independent trade analysis cited by multiple outlets, this is confirmed. Section 338, as written and signed, applies even to USMCA-compliant goods. That detail alone is what makes August 19 different from every other deadline Trump has set against Canada this year. And there have been a lot of deadlines. Rewind further, back to early August, when a previous tariff threshold came and went. Trump had given Canada until August 1st to strike a deal, and when that date passed without one, he raised existing tariffs on a range of Canadian goods from 25% to 35%, applying to products that fall outside the USMCA framework. Prime Minister Mark Carney, at the time, called the move disappointing and told Canadians the country would become its own best customer, a line meant to signal defiance rather than panic. Trump, for his part, told reporters that Canada might simply be a country where there is, in his words, just a tariff, not really a negotiation. That was the temperature heading into August, and it only got colder from there. On July 28th, in a phone interview with Fox News Channel's Fox and Friends, Trump was asked directly whether he had any interest in preserving or updating USMCA, the very agreement his own administration negotiated in his first term. His answer was blunt. "I don't care," he said. "I mean, I don't really want to. I'd rather be independent. Here's the thing. Mexico and Canada need us. We don't need them. The deal is important for them. It's not important for us." That statement landed on the same morning Canada's government announced that Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-US relations, was heading back to Washington for another round of talks. The contrast could not have been sharper. Ottawa, dispatching its top negotiator to save an agreement the President of the United States had just said, on the record, that he did not care about. It's worth remembering that this deadline is not even the first one the two leaders set for themselves. Back in June of 2025, at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, Carney and Trump stood side by side and agreed to a 30-day target for reaching a trade deal, the first time either side had put a firm timeline on ending the trade war. Trump told reporters at the summit that he was sure the two countries could work something out, while acknowledging he considers himself, in his own words, a tariff person who likes the simplicity of broad levies. Carney, at the same event, described his own approach as a different concept, one Trump said some people like, and that the two sides were going to see if they could make work. That 30-day window came and went without a lasting resolution, and it set the pattern that has repeated itself ever since. Deadline, negotiation, partial progress, new deadline. A month later, after Trump unveiled the 50% tariff plan that eventually became Section 338, Carney told reporters he and Trump had spoken directly and agreed to intensify negotiations in the coming weeks, adding that Canadians, governments, business, and labor would stand together to build the country strong while still pursuing a trading relationship that benefits everyone on both sides of the border. That same period saw Carney publicly push back on one specific idea floated as possible: Canadian leverage. telling reporters he did not, in his words, see the value in using Canadian energy exports as a bargaining chip in the negotiations, a notable restraint given how often energy has been used as leverage in trade disputes elsewhere in the world. There's also a diplomatic wrinkle that has nothing to do with tariffs on paper, but everything to do with the mood surrounding these negotiations. In recent weeks, Canada announced it would formally recognize Palestinian statehood, a move that drew a sharp and specific reaction from Trump, who wrote on his Truth Social platform that the decision would, quote, make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them, closing with a sarcastic, "Oh, Canada." It is a reminder that these negotiations are not happening in a sterile economic vacuum. They are entangled with foreign policy disputes, personal rhetoric, and a broader pattern in Trump's approach to Canada that includes his repeated and widely dismissed suggestion that Canada should become the 51st American state. That comment, made more than once over the past year, is often treated as a throwaway line by American audiences. In Ottawa, it is taken as a serious signal about how the current administration views Canadian sovereignty, and it has shaped the tone of every negotiating session since. So that is the backdrop. Now to the plan itself, the one that just dropped, and the reason this video exists. According to CBC News, which cited sources briefed directly on the talks, Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette and her American counterpart, United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, spent the first 2 weeks of August racing to build a joint proposal, a document detailed enough that it could be presented to both Trump and Carney as a concrete path out of the crisis. CBC reported that LeBlanc and Greer aimed to get that proposal in front of Trump as early as the Monday before the deadline, giving the president at least a full day to review it before Section 338 automatically triggers. That timeline slipped. According to the Globe and Mail, LeBlanc's plane was actually turned back to Montreal due to weather on the day he was supposed to return to Washington, a small logistical detail that, in a negotiation running on a countdown clock, mattered more than it should have. By August 13th, Greer told reporters that both Trump and Carney would now be given, in his words, options, plural, following a fresh round of talks between Canadian and American officials. Options is a carefully chosen word. It suggests not a finished deal, but a menu, a set of possible frameworks that the two leaders now have to choose between, reject, or modify, with the clock still running. And what is actually on that menu has been reported with increasing consistency across multiple outlets. According to the Detroit News and the Washington Post, both citing people familiar with the confidential negotiations, the emerging framework would have the United States shelve the new Section 338 tariffs entirely and separately reduce the 25% Section 232 tariffs that Trump imposed on foreign-made steel, aluminum, and autos, tariffs that hit Canadian industries whose supply chains are deeply and historically integrated with American manufacturing. In exchange, Canada would be expected to remove some of its own retaliatory tariffs against the United States and address a list of what American officials have called trade irritants, chief among them the provincial bans on American alcohol. This alcohol dispute deserves its own explanation, because it has become one of the most politically loaded pieces of the entire negotiation. After Trump's earlier round of tariffs on Canadian goods, citing what he described as Canada's failure to stop illicit fentanyl from crossing into the United States, nearly every Canadian province except Alberta and Saskatchewan pulled American wine, beer, and spirits off government-run store shelves. It was a retaliatory measure, popular domestically, and according to Rachel Ziemba, an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, it was significant. Ziemba noted that Canada had been the largest importer of American alcohol by volume before the ban, and that Canadian imports of American wine fell by more than 80% since February of 2025, with other alcohol categories dropping by a similar magnitude. CBC News, citing United States Census Bureau figures, reported that the provincial bans resulted in a $360 million drop in American wine exports to Canada in 2025 alone, alongside a $150 million drop in spirit exports. Those are American jobs and American revenue lost, which is exactly why the Trump administration has made lifting the alcohol bans a central demand in any deal. But here is where the plan that Canada has put forward creates the huge problem the title of this video is pointing to. According to Vision Times, citing an August 12th CBC News report with two sources familiar with the negotiations, the United States submitted its own counterproposal on August 11th that would reduce some of the sectoral tariffs Canada is asking about, but not nearly as much as Ottawa wanted. In other words, the two sides are not simply finalizing a handshake agreement, they are still haggling, days before the deadline, over how much relief Canada actually gets in exchange for the concessions it is prepared to make. And the reporting suggests Canada is not simply capitulating to get a deal done at any cost. According to 5 sources cited by the Globe and Mail, Janice Charette personally warned Greer that if the August 19th tariffs go into effect as scheduled, it would represent what one source called a cliff, a moment so damaging to the political mood in Canada that it could halt negotiations altogether rather than accelerate them. 3 of those sources told the Globe and Mail that Charette went further, telling Greer directly that if the tariffs are imposed, the Canadian government would be forced by public pressure to retaliate. And a retaliation from Ottawa, according to one of those same sources, would almost certainly provoke a counter-retaliation from Trump, escalating a trade war that is already bruising both economies rather than closing it out. This is the trap. Trump built a deadline designed to force Canada into concessions. Canada responded not by folding, but by building its own detailed counter-framework and delivering a blunt warning alongside it. Impose these tariffs, and you don't get leverage. You get a diplomatic collapse that could set relations back even further, at a moment when his own trade representative has already floated the idea of shelving the tariffs as part of a deal. Trump now has to decide whether to trigger a measure his own team may already be negotiating away, or back down from a deadline he set publicly and repeatedly in front of the entire world. And there is real economic pressure bearing down on that decision from inside the United States itself, not just from Ottawa. 2 major American industrial unions, the United Steelworkers and the International Association of Machinists, sent a joint letter to Jamieson Greer on July 28th, urging the administration to reconsider tariffs on Canadian goods entirely, and instead focus trade pressure on China. Roxanne Brown, the international president of the United Steelworkers, put it directly in a public statement saying, "Our 2 nations share a deep collaboration built on decades of economic integration, as well as intelligence and defense cooperation." That is a labor union, a constituency Trump has spent years courting as part of his political base, publicly asking him to ease off Canada. It is not the kind of pressure a White House can easily wave away, especially heading into a period where American manufacturing employment numbers have already started showing strain. According to the Labor Department, job growth slowed to just 73,000 positions in July, with earlier figures for May and June revised sharply downward, a trend some economists have directly linked to the uncertainty created by the broader tariff regime. Uncertainty that makes companies reluctant to hire until they know what the final trade landscape actually looks like. There's also a consumer side to this story that rarely makes the headlines but tells you exactly how deep the damage has already gone. According to figures reported by Tech Times, Canadian purchases of American-made vehicles dropped 22%, roughly $5.6 billion, between April of 2025 and March 2026, as Canadian consumers and businesses shifted toward vehicles built in Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Germany instead. That is not a hypothetical future cost of an escalating trade war. That is money that has already left the American auto industry and gone to its direct competitors, a permanent shift in consumer behavior that a last-minute tariff relief deal may not simply reverse. Trade relationships, once broken, do not automatically reset the moment a new agreement is signed. Trust and buying habits take much longer to rebuild than tariff schedules take to write. Meanwhile, inside Canada, the political balancing act facing Prime Minister Mark Carney is its own kind of pressure cooker. Carney has repeated one line, almost like a mantra, throughout this entire process. Canada will not accept a bad deal. He said it to provincial leaders. He has said it to reporters. He said it again as recently as this month, according to Bloomberg's reporting on the state of the talks. But that stance runs directly into the reality that Canada is a federation, not a single unified negotiating bloc, and every province has its own interests that Carney has to somehow reconcile into one national position. In Quebec, Premier Christine Frechette is pushing hard for reduced tariffs on aluminum, an industry that matters enormously to the province's economy, but her office has made clear she is not willing to trade away protections for the province's dairy sector to get it. A spokesperson for Frechette told reporters that, in the context of the ongoing trade war, the Premier continues to defend Quebec's economic interests, a diplomatic way of saying Quebec is not simply going to accept whatever framework Ottawa negotiates in Washington without a fight of its own. That is the difficulty of governing Canada as a federation, according to Brian Clow, a former deputy chief of staff and advisor on Canada-U.S. relations to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who now advises companies on cross-border and geopolitical risk. Clow told the Globe and Mail that the very fact these negotiations have been this sustained is itself notable, saying it means there is a real chance for a deal, but cautioning that sustained talks do not guarantee an outcome. With 1 week to go before the deadline, at the time of his comments, Clow pointed out there was very little time left to work through technical and complex policy details and still get every province on side. There's also a blunt economic warning circulating in Canadian business circles that has added even more urgency to Carney's position. According to a report cited by Retail Insider Canada, a breakdown of the U.S.-Canada trade agreement, meaning a failure to reach any deal at all before the deadline, could cost Canada roughly 102,000 jobs. That is the kind of number that turns an abstract trade dispute into a very real, very local political liability for any sitting prime minister. And it is exactly the kind of number Charette was almost certainly thinking about when she warned Greer that the August 19th tariffs would represent a cliff for the negotiations, not just a policy setback. Now, where does all of this actually leave Trump, and why does the plan Canada has put forward create such a specific problem for him? Consider the position he is in. His own administration's trade representative has already signaled to the press that both leaders will be handed options, a word that implies the White House itself is not fully committed to letting the 50% Section 338 tariffs simply take effect as originally signed. According to the Detroit News, the emerging framework under discussion as of mid-August would have the United States shelving those tariffs and reducing Section 232 duties on steel, aluminum, and autos, a framework that, if adopted, essentially reverses the core economic weapon Trump used to bring Canada to the table in the first place. If Trump signs off on that kind of deal, critics at home, particularly the more hawkish tariff-first wing of his own political coalition, could accuse him of blinking, of setting a dramatic 50% deadline and then quietly folding when Ottawa pushed back hard enough. But if Trump instead lets the tariffs go into effect as scheduled at midnight on August 19th, he risks the exact scenario Charette described to Greer: a collapse in negotiations, a forced Canadian retaliation, and a counter-retaliation of his own, all while facing pressure from American steelworkers, machinists, and auto industry stakeholders who have already told him directly that the tariffs are hurting them more than they are hurting Canada. There's no clean outcome here. Every path forward carries a political cost, and that is precisely the huge problem this video's title is pointing toward. Canada did not simply ask for mercy. It built a detailed counter-framework, backed it with a direct warning about the consequences of inaction, and forced Trump into a decision where both the deal and the deadline now carry real risk to his own political position. It's also worth stepping back and asking why Section 338 specifically was the tool Trump reached for this time, because it is not a provision that gets used often. And the choice itself tells you something about how determined the administration was to close every loophole Canada might have used to soften the blow. Ordinary tariff actions under other sections of American trade law typically allow for carve-outs, exemptions for goods that comply with existing free trade agreements like USMCA. Section 338 does not offer that same protection in the way it was applied here. By selecting this specific legal mechanism, the administration effectively told Ottawa that the normal rules of the trading relationship, the very rules Trump's own first-term administration wrote into USMCA, would not apply this time. That is a significant escalation in tone, even beyond the raw 50% number attached to the tariff. It signals a willingness to bypass the existing framework entirely rather than simply raise rates within it, and it is part of why Canadian officials have described the coming deadline in such stark terms. There's a legal backstory here too, and it explains a lot about why Section 1338 was chosen at all, rather than one of the tools Trump had already been using for most of the past year. Back on February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court issued a major ruling in a pair of consolidated cases, Learning Resources versus Trump and Trump versus VOS selections. In a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice Roberts, the court held that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEEPA, does not actually authorize a president to impose tariffs at all. That statute had been the legal foundation for a huge share of Trump's trade agenda throughout 2025, including the tariffs originally imposed on Canada beginning in March of that year and the broader, so-called Liberation Day tariffs applied to dozens of countries in April. According to analysis from the Tax Foundation, those IEPA-based tariffs had already generated more than $160 billion for the federal government by the time the ruling came down, and were projected to raise as much as $1.4 trillion over the following decade had they remained in place. The Supreme Court's ruling effectively erased that legal foundation overnight. According to the law firm White & Case, all IEPA-based tariffs officially terminated at midnight Eastern Time on February 24, 2026, after President Trump issued an executive order directing Customs and Border Protection to stop collecting them. That ruling did not end Trump's tariff strategy. It forced him to pivot. According to Fasken, a firm that specializes in advising Canadian businesses on cross-border trade law, Trump moved quickly to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, signing a proclamation the same day as the ruling that imposed a 10% global import surcharge, with an exemption carved out for goods qualifying under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. That pivot meant tariffs on non-qualifying Canadian imports actually dropped, at least temporarily, from 35% under the old IEEPA framework down to somewhere between 10 and 15%, depending on which of Trump's public statements you take as the operative figure. But Section 122 has its own legal limitations, and Section 232, the national security justification used for steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs, was never touched by the Supreme Court ruling at all, because it rests on entirely separate statutory authority tied to national security rather than emergency economic powers. That is precisely why those Section 232 tariffs are still sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos today, and why they are one of the two major tariff categories, alongside the new Section 338 duties that Canadian negotiators are trying to get reduced as part of any deal struck before August 19th. Section 338, the provision behind the current 50% tariff threat, is different again. It is an old and rarely used piece of trade law that does not depend on the emergency powers the Supreme Court just stripped away, which is exactly why it became Trump's tool of choice this time. Having lost his broadest tariff authority in February, and with Section 232 already committed to steel, aluminum, and auto specifically, Section 338 gave the administration a fresh legal mechanism to apply serious pressure directly to Canada without needing to relitigate the emergency powers question the Supreme Court had just resolved against him. Understanding that sequence, the IEEPA ruling in February, the pivot to Section 122 and continued reliance on Section 232, and now the escalation to Section 338 in July, makes the current standoff look less like a single isolated threat, and more like the fourth or fifth chapter in a running legal and political battle over exactly how much tariff power the president actually has, and how far he is willing to stretch whatever authority remains available to him. At the same time, it would be inaccurate and irresponsible to present this as a certainty in either direction. As of the most recent reporting available, nothing has been finalized. The Washington Post described the two sides as inching closer to a deal based on conversations with industry executives and trade specialists following the talks, but the same reporting explicitly noted that details remain fluid and that recent negotiating sessions were contentious heading into the deadline. The Detroit News, publishing on August 16th, echoed that characterization almost exactly, describing an emerging accord that could pair Canadian concessions on energy, defense, and critical minerals with a U.S. agreement to shelve the Section 338 tariffs and relax the steel and aluminum duties, while also noting that talks remained contentious right up to the eve of the deadline. Reuters, reporting from Ottawa on August 13th, quoted an unnamed Canadian government source who said negotiations were, in the source's words, progressing well, and that the source was also seeing some positive signals coming from the American side. That same source, however, chose to remain anonymous, which is itself a small but telling detail. Officials confident enough in a deal to put their names behind it tend to do so. Sources still speaking anonymously, days before deadline, are often hedging against the possibility that things fall apart before ink ever touches paper. So what does Trump actually do? There are broadly three roads open to him as August 19th approaches, and each carries its own version of the problem. The first is to accept the framework largely as negotiated, shelving Section 338 and easing the Section 232 tariffs in exchange for Canada's concessions on alcohol, autos, and dairy-related trade irritants, plus new commitments on energy, defense cooperation, and critical minerals. This gives him a deal he can publicly frame as a win, but it also means walking back the exact tariff threat that generated headlines for weeks, at the risk of looking like he negotiated down from his own maximalist position. The second road is to let the deadline hit as scheduled, imposing the full 50% duty on August 19th, regardless of where the talks stand, betting that maximum pressure eventually forces an even better deal down the line. This is consistent with his stated approach throughout the year, treating deadlines as genuinely real rather than as opening offers. But Charette's warning to Greer suggests Canada may not respond to that kind of pressure the way the administration expects, and the union pressure at home adds a domestic political cost to that choice as well. The third road, and arguably the messiest, is some kind of partial extension or last-minute modification, buying more time without fully committing to either shelving the tariffs or letting them take full effect, a path that risks satisfying no one, prolonging the uncertainty that economists have already tied to slowing job growth and simply resetting the same high-stakes countdown clock for a future date. Whichever path Trump chooses, the plan Canada has put together, backed by Charette's direct warning, LeBlanc's repeated trips to Washington, and a joint proposal that reportedly reduces some tariffs without fully satisfying Ottawa's demands, has changed the calculus. It is no longer simply a story about whether Canada will fold under pressure. It is a story about whether the pressure Trump built for himself through Section 338, through his own public rhetoric about not needing Canada, through a deadline set and reset multiple times over the course of the year, can actually be walked back without a political cost. He seems unwilling to openly accept. That is the huge problem hiding underneath the headline, not whether Canada has a plan. It clearly does. The problem is whether Trump has a way out of the situation he created that doesn't require him to either concede publicly or risk the exact economic and diplomatic fallout his own negotiators have reportedly been warned about. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about exactly what is confirmed here and what remains uncertain, because a story moving this fast deserves that honesty. It is confirmed through Reuters, CBC News, CTV News, the Globe and Mail, and the Detroit News that Section 338 tariffs of 50% on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods across 554 tariff lines are legally set to take effect on August 19th, unless the administration acts to stop them. It is confirmed that Trump made the July 28th comments about not caring to preserve USMCA, reported directly by Tech Times. It is confirmed through CBC News, citing multiple sources, that Greer described both leaders as being handed options following the August 13th round of talks. What is not confirmed and remains genuinely uncertain as of this recording is the final content of any agreement, whether it will actually be signed before the deadline, and whether the framework described by the Washington Post and Detroit News, built on background sourcing from people familiar with confidential negotiations, will survive contact with both Trump and Carney once it's formally presented. The specific claim from Charette that Canada would be, in her words, forced by the public to retaliate if the tariffs proceed, comes from sources briefed on a private meeting, reported by the Globe and Mail, and while it has been consistently corroborated across 5 separate sources cited in that reporting, it remains something Charette herself has not confirmed publicly on the record. That distinction matters. Good journalism and a good analysis treats background sourcing carefully, even when it comes from a credible outlet with multiple independent sources lining up on the same account. So here is where this leaves things, heading into the final stretch before midnight on August 19th. Ottawa has built and delivered its plan. Washington has, according to its own trade representative, generated a set of options for both leaders to weigh. American labor unions are publicly pushing back against tariffs on a close ally. Canadian provinces are fractured over how much they're willing to give up. And the president who set this deadline now has to decide whether triggering it proves his leverage or proves that his own negotiators had already found a better path he chose to ignore. What do you think happens at midnight on August 19th? Does Trump let the 50% tariffs take effect exactly as signed? Or does the framework his own trade representative has been quietly building with Ottawa win out at the last minute? Do you think Canada's warning about a cliff in negotiations is a real red line, or a negotiating tactic designed to extract a better deal before the deadline hits? And if the tariffs do go into effect, do you think Ottawa actually follows through on retaliation, knowing it could trigger yet another round of counter-tariffs from Washington? Drop your prediction in the comments, because this is one of those stories where informed guesses from people paying close attention are often more useful than the official statements coming out of either capital. If you want a clear, sourced breakdown the moment this actually resolves, whichever direction it goes, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the follow-up once the deadline passes, and the real outcome, not just the plan, is confirmed. And if you found this breakdown useful, share it with someone who's been trying to make sense of the Canada tariff story without wading through a dozen conflicting headlines themselves. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's real news to report out of Ottawa or Washington on where this actually lands.